Imagine standing on a frozen highway leading into the heart of Moscow. The air cuts like knives. The horizon glows a dim orange fires burning miles away. And then you hear it. Not the wind, not distant engines, but the steady, relentless crunch of boots. Thousands of them, advancing, unstoppable. A column of armor follows, steel silhouettes emerging from the blizzard like ghosts. For a moment, you wonder if history itself is shattering in front of you. Now picture the unthinkable. The red star over the Kremlin replaced by a black banner. The political, cultural, and military center of the Soviet Union gone in a single, decisive blow. Europe holding its breath. The world tilting toward a future no one can predict. This is the crossroads of 1941, a moment where one change, just one, could have rewritten an entire century. What if Nazi Germany had captured Moscow? What would have fallen next? How would the world map look today? Welcome, history warriors, I'm Knightley. You're about to witness history like never before, and the path to this alternate timeline begins with understanding the world on the eve of catastrophe. In the autumn of 1941, the world stood at a razor's edge. Europe had been shaken, conquered, carved apart with stunning speed. From the Atlantic coast of France to the gates of Leningrad, German forces dominated the continent. Their next target was the beating heart of the Soviet Union, Moscow. The city was more than a capital. It was the command center of Soviet political power, the hub of rail networks feeding every front, and the symbolic core of an empire fighting for survival. If it fell, the shock would echo across the world. Operation Barbarossa, Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, had begun with staggering momentum. 3 massive army groups pushed deep into Soviet territory, millions of troops, thousands of tanks and aircraft. For a brief moment, it seemed nothing could stop them. Yet the Soviet Union, battered but unbroken, refused to collapse. New armies emerged, industry relocated eastward. The defense stiffened. But as October turned to November, all eyes shifted to a single axis, the road to Moscow. The German Army Group Center hurled its strongest divisions forward, including veteran panzer units that had crushed every opponent before them. Facing them were Soviet forces stretched thin, cold, exhausted, yet desperately defending the last barrier between survival and defeat. The stakes were immense. The fall of Moscow could fracture Soviet command, dislocate supply lines, and ignite political turmoil. Germany hoped it would end the war in the east before winter fully arrived. But winter was coming fast, and with it, the cruel question, could Germany take Moscow before the cold stopped everything? As pressure closed in on the city from all sides, the stage was set for a showdown that could reshape the world. To understand how Moscow could fall, we must go inside the minds of the commanders shaping the battlefield. On the German side stood Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, a disciplined, rigid strategist who believed in decisive, lightning blows. Beneath him, panzer commanders like Heinz Guderian, restless, bold, always pressing forward, argued that speed was everything. Their goal was simple: drive straight to Moscow, break the Soviet center, and force collapse before winter closed its iron fist. The German plan focused on one core belief: that the Soviet Union was already defeated. The rapid encirclements at Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev seemed to confirm it. Entire Soviet armies had been destroyed or forced into chaotic retreats. German leadership, convinced victory was near, concentrated elite armored divisions toward the Moscow axis. The strategy hinged on momentum: keep pushing, keep destroying, never let the Soviets stabilize. But behind the Soviet lines, another story unfolded. Joseph Stalin, shaken by the early disasters, began allowing his generals more freedom to act. Georgy Zhukov, tough, tireless, and unflinchingly direct, took charge of Moscow's defense. His focus was survival. Hold long enough for reserves to arrive from Siberia, hold long enough for factories newly relocated to the Urals to begin producing weapons, hold long enough for winter to become an ally. Soviet industry had accomplished a miracle. Entire factories, machines, workers, families were dismantled and moved eastward beyond German reach. Production slowed, but never stopped. Meanwhile, troops trained in Siberia, hardened by brutal cold, were redeployed west under the strictest secrecy. These units would become a hidden weapon, timed to strike when the weather turned. Weapons on both sides reflected the clash of doctrines. German Panzer III and IV tanks, precise and well-engineered, were deadly in maneuver warfare. Their logistics system, however, strained under distance and terrain. Soviet T-34s, less refined but robust and deadly in mud and snow, entered the fight in growing numbers. On foot, Soviet infantry now wielded new anti-tank rifles and more concentrated artillery support. The Germans relied on their own formidable artillery and the relentless Stuka dive bombers, though winter clouds increasingly grounded them. The geography around Moscow further shaped the plans. Dense forests, frozen rivers and narrow roads funneled German advances into predictable paths. The Soviets built layered defenses, trenches, anti-tank ditches, minefields, designed to bleed the attackers slowly. Railway lines behind Moscow allowed rapid movement of reinforcements, while the Germans depended on long, overstretched supply columns vulnerable to weather and raids. As October began, both sides tightened their grip on fate. The Germans believed they had one last offensive push left before exhaustion. Every commander understood the stakes. Guderian demanded fuel and ammunition that scarcely existed. Von Bock urged speed, despite worsening conditions. At higher levels, Hitler insisted Moscow must fall, even as generals warned of logistical disaster. But the dream of a final, decisive victory drowned out caution. Inside Moscow, the atmosphere had shifted from fear to grim determination. Trenches cut across city outskirts. Civilians dug anti-tank obstacles. Soviet leadership reinforced communications bunkers beneath the streets. Zhukov's command posts buzzed with activity reports of German movements, preparation of fallback lines, deployment of reserves. Every hour mattered. Every kilometer lost had to be paid for in German strength. As both armies closed in on the decisive moment, the tension grew unbearable. German troops marched with frostbitten hands but unwavering discipline. Soviet soldiers, hearing the thunder of artillery inching closer, swore to hold the line or die where they stood. The sky dimmed earlier each day. Snow began to fall more heavily. Time itself seemed to accelerate toward a single point. November approached. The German spearheads gathered. The Soviets braced, and the world watched unknowingly as history prepared to pivot. Every plan was in place. Every hope, every fear, tightened into the narrow corridor leading to Moscow. Silence before the storm. Dawn broke as a pale smear across the frozen sky. German scouts advanced through the mist, their silhouettes sharp against the snow. They expected scattered resistance. Instead, the first Soviet trenches erupted with gunfire. Tracer rounds sliced the air. Grenades arced overhead. The long-awaited assault on Moscow had begun with a blast that shook the horizon. German artillery answered instantly. Shells hammered Soviet lines, kicking up fountains of frozen earth. Smoke churned across the fields east of Volokholamsk. Panzer engines roared to life. The ground trembled beneath their advance. Infantry marched behind them in tight, disciplined formations, unfazed by the cold that cut through uniforms like blades. Soviet defenders braced inside snow-packed trenches. Their breath hung like fog. The first wave of German armor loomed out of the haze giant steel shadows. Anti-tank crews aimed their rifles and cannons. The recoil punched their shoulders as the first volley fired. A panzer ground to a halt, smoking. But the rest pushed on relentlessly. The battle surged forward like a flood. Soviet machine gunners stitched the snow with sweeping arcs of fire. German infantry dropped low and returned bursts that snapped branches and shattered wooden bunkers. The front line twisted, bent, nearly broke, but held. For the moment. Deeper along the axis, Guderian's Panzer Corps punched through a forest corridor. Trees blurred as tanks advanced at full throttle. A Soviet roadblock ahead exploded under a direct hit from a German 75mm shell. Trucks and debris scattered across the frozen road. The armored spear point pressed forward with unstoppable momentum, but the Soviets fired back hard. Concealed artillery batteries unleashed a hail of shells. Explosions erupted around the panzers, shaking steel hulls and filling turrets with choking dust. One tank veered into a ditch, immobilized. Another burned, Yet still the German formation surged onward, fueled by the belief that victory lay just one more breakthrough away. Northeast of the city, Soviet cavalry launched a sudden counterattack. Their rifles cracked, hooves churning snow as they dashed between German infantry lines, scattering units and delaying the advance. Brief, fierce, unexpected. Then they vanished back into the tree line, leaving confusion in their wake. The Luftwaffe dove in next. Stukas dropped out of the clouds, sirens wailing, bombs spinning toward Soviet batteries. Bursts of flame rolled across the fields. Trenches collapsed. Yet the weather turned treacherous within minutes. Snow thickened, grounding more aircraft. The sky closed like a curtain. Soviet troops exploited the moment. From behind ruined farmhouses and shattered tree lines, they swarmed forward. Submachine gun fire filled the air. German squads held their ground, but every meter cost sweat, blood, and precious ammunition. The momentum wavered. Neither side could claim the field. In the center, the fiercest fighting erupted along the Mozhaisk defensive line. This was no simple barrier. It was a labyrinth of trenches, bunkers, gun nests, and fortified villages. German units battered it with artillery before storming forward. But Soviet soldiers, many barely trained, stood firm with a determination that defied logic. House by house, street by street, the village of Borodino turned into a maze of fire and shadows. Germans took one building only to face ambushes from the next. Soviet snipers lurked in attic windows. Mortar rounds burst in courtyards. Smoke smothered the air. Neither side surrendered an inch without a fight. Yet slowly, inevitably, the Germans gained ground. Better coordination, veteran leadership, the crushing weight of armor. They forced Soviet defenders back through the ruins, step by agonizing step. The road to Moscow, though bloodied and cracked, began to open. By midday, the temperature plunged, weapons jammed, fuel thickened. Frostbite gnawed at exposed skin, but the battle only intensified. German panzers formed wedges and drove directly into Soviet strongpoints. Infantry followed, clearing trenches with grenades and short bursts of rifle fire. Chaos whirled around every position. Zhukov's command posts crackled with urgent reports. "Breakthrough near Ruza! Heavy armor approaching Volokolamsk! Request reinforcements!" He sent reserves to threatened sectors, moving units by night along icy roads. The line bent dangerously, but did not snap. Then came a turning moment within the battle itself. A Soviet artillery regiment, hidden in a forest clearing, unleashed a perfectly timed barrage on a German armored column. Shells crashed down in rapid succession. The road became a graveyard of shattered metal. The advance paused. Precious minutes were bought. But the Germans adapted quickly. Flanking units bypassed the wreckage. Engineers built makeshift bridges across frozen streams. Supply trucks groaned forward under impossible loads. Every soldier knew the same truth: reach Moscow or freeze trying. As daylight faded, the battlefield turned into a twilight of fire. German searchlights swept across Soviet trenches. Flamethrower teams advanced through smoke. Soviet machine gunners responded with relentless determination. The sound of battle reverberated for miles, rolling thunder across the plains. In the forests north of the highway, Soviet partisans ambushed a German supply column. Explosions lit the trees. Horses panicked. Ammo crates burned. The German front, stretched thin, felt the sting immediately. Fuel shortages worsened. Delays rippled toward the spearheads. Still, the Germans pushed on. Every kilometer gained felt like victory. Every Soviet position overrun fed their confidence. They believed the city was within reach, so close they could almost see its distant skyline through the swirling snow. Night arrived harsh and silent. Fires crackled across the battlefield. Wounded men were carried back through drifts of snow. Officers pored over maps lit by dim lamps. The next morning would bring another assault, harder, heavier, more desperate. At dawn, the Germans launched their most aggressive thrust yet. Panzer divisions massed into a single corridor, engines roaring. Infantry clung to their flanks. The attack tore forward like a steel avalanche. Soviet lines buckled under the weight. But inside Moscow, the Soviet command refused to yield. Reinforcements poured in fresh divisions from the east, wrapped in heavy white coats. They took their places along defensive lines carved into frozen earth, waiting for the enemy to arrive. The closer the Germans pushed, the more fanatically the Soviets resisted. Machine gun nests hidden in snowbanks caught advancing infantry in deadly crossfire. Mines detonated beneath panzer treads. Soviet artillery, firing almost point-blank, shook the ground. Momentum swung wildly. A German breakthrough near the city's western edge collapsed when a Soviet counterattack struck its exposed flank. The battlefield dissolved into confusion. Commanders scrambled to reorganize their lines. Snowstorms swept in, blinding both sides. For hours, neither army advanced more than a few hundred meters. The fight became raw endurance. Who could last longer? Who could hold under the unforgiving cold? Soldiers fired until their rifles iced over. Medics worked with numb hands. Officers shouted through the wind. Then, abruptly, a new threat emerged for the Germans. Ammunition shortages. Supply trucks bogged down in deepening snow. Fuel reserves dwindled fast. The spearheads slowed, not from resistance alone, but from starvation of the very lifeblood of modern warfare logistics. Still, one final push remained. Von Bock issued the order. Guderian drove his tanks toward the outskirts. Soviet defenses reeled under the shock. For a moment, just a moment, it looked as if Moscow might fall. But the Soviets refused to break. Fresh reserves counterattacked with ferocious discipline. White-clad infantry stormed German positions. Anti-tank teams swarmed the panzer flanks. The German advance stalled in a frozen storm of resistance. By nightfall, both armies were exhausted. Fires smoldered across the plains. Tanks steamed in the cold, engines ticking as they cooled. The terrible push toward Moscow had begun, but its outcome hung in fragile balance. And deep in the cold darkness, the moment that would change everything silently approached. The turning point. The turning point did not arrive with a roar. It began with a whisper, an unexpected shift in the air, a deeper cold than anyone anticipated. Temperatures plunged overnight far lower than German forecasts had predicted. Engines froze. Oil thickened like tar. Weapons jammed at the worst possible moments. The battlefield itself turned against the attackers. German soldiers woke to find their tanks immobilized, their rifles stiff, their breath crystallizing instantly. What had been a harsh winter became a merciless one. Supply trucks stranded miles behind the front stiffened into useless hulks. The offensive, built on speed, faltered at the very moment it needed momentum most. But cold alone didn't save Moscow. Zhukov had been waiting for this exact moment. Fresh Soviet divisions men, hardened by the Siberian frontier, finally arrived. They moved across the snow with ease, wrapped in heavy white coats. Their officers were calm, confident, unshaken by the weather that crippled the Germans. Zhukov's command staff recorded those hours with simple words. "The enemy is slowing. We will counterattack." It was not bravado. It was calculation. The Soviets saw the German lines stretched thin, saw the slowing armor, saw the hesitations. They knew the window was narrow, but real. A critical German mistake sealed the shift. Despite worsening conditions, Hitler insisted the offensive continue unchanged. Fuel shortages were ignored. Reports of freezing engines dismissed. When generals urged withdrawal to regroup, the answer was blunt. Moscow must fall. The dream of a swift victory blinded leadership to the reality unfolding on the ground. Historians later summarized it simply. The Germans had reached their limit. Their command refused to see it. That refusal created the gap the Soviets needed. Every kilometer the Germans pushed forward now cost triple what it had weeks earlier. Their strength bled away faster than they could replace it. Meanwhile, Soviet morale surged. The arrival of Siberian troops was like thunder rolling across the lines. Rumors spread among defenders. Reinforcements are here. Fresh divisions. We're no longer alone. For soldiers who had fought for weeks without relief, this shift felt almost miraculous. Then came the intelligence breakthrough. Intercepts captured by Soviet radio units revealed gaps in German supply routes points where fuel shortages had created delays and forced columns to halt. Zhukov studied the reports, then issued the order that would tilt the balance, strike the flanks, not the center. On the northern front, a Soviet rifle division launched a sudden assault into a gap between two German infantry regiments. The attack ripped open a seam in the line. German commanders scrambled to reinforce it, but had no reserves left. Every battalion was already committed forward. The floor widened. In the south, Soviet ski troops glided across frozen rivers and smashed into German artillery positions that had been hastily relocated due to the cold. The guns, unable to fire at full rate, were overrun. This loss weakened German fire support across the entire sector. Guderian reportedly muttered, "We are fighting ghosts in a white hell." His panzers, designed for movement, now sat immobilized. Soviet soldiers swarmed around them, attacking from angles that would have been suicidal weeks earlier. The battlefield rules had changed. By the second day of the cold snap, German divisions lost their rhythm entirely. Coordination broke down. Communications froze. Officers struggled to issue orders as radios failed and runners collapsed from exhaustion. The offensive no longer moved as one united force, but as scattered pockets fighting to survive the weather. Zhukov struck hardest when German weakness peaked. At dawn, he unleashed a coordinated counter-offensive along multiple axes. The Siberian troops, fresh and well-equipped for winter, charged forward with controlled ferocity. Their advance shocked German units already battered by cold and exhaustion. A German captain later recalled, "They appeared out of the snow itself." White-clad Soviet infantry moved silently until the last rushed steps. In many places, German defenders had no time to react. Positions that had held for hours collapsed in minutes. The Soviets understood the terrain intimately. They navigated frozen marshes, forest paths, and snowdrifts as if they were fighting on familiar ground. The Germans, struggling with maps and unreliable equipment, could not match their agility. The attackers became the hunted. Strategically, the turning point crystallized into one brutal truth. German logistics had snapped. Ammunition consumption outpaced delivery. Fuel deliveries dropped dangerously low. Artillery units rationed shells. Even food supplies dwindled. The offensive could no longer sustain itself. Zhukov reinforced every success instantly. When a Soviet unit broke through a weak sector, reserves followed to widen the gap. When German lines bent, pressure increased. Every move was designed not just to repel the advance, but to reverse it. The counter-offensive gained momentum like a growing storm. One historian captured the moment with a chilling line. The Germans were no longer advancing toward Moscow. They were fighting not to be encircled near it. Panic never erupted openly, but officers recognized the danger. If they continued forward, they risked total collapse. Hitler refused to authorize retreat. This decision deepened the crisis. German divisions were forced to hold exposed positions under brutal winter pressure. Soviet attacks grew more coordinated, more precise, striking weak points mercilessly. The front buckled. At last, the balance broke. A Soviet armored brigade, supported by artillery, smashed into a German flank near Krasnaya Polyana, just 30 kilometers from the Kremlin. The attack shattered one of the German divisions anchoring the offensive. Lines crumbled, units fell back in disorder. This collapse rippled outward. German commanders realized the offensive was finished. They no longer fought for Moscow, they fought to escape annihilation. The turning point became undeniable. The dream of capturing the Soviet capital faded into the frozen wind. And as the Soviets pressed forward, the Germans began the slow, painful retreat that would define the rest of the campaign. Aftermath and consequences. When the German offensive finally stalled, the battlefield around Moscow resembled a frozen labyrinth of abandoned vehicles, shattered trenches, and snowdrifts hiding the wreckage of two exhausted armies. The push that had once aimed confidently at the Kremlin was now a retreat marked by scarcity, confusion, and harsh winter winds that cut through clothing like knives. German units pulled back in staggered formations. Commanders tried to maintain order, but long supply lines and the deteriorating weather made every movement slow and painful. Weapons froze, horses collapsed, fuel arrived too late, too little. Retreat was no longer strategy, it was survival. For the Soviets, the counter-offensive sparked a surge of determination. Reinforcements kept arriving, bringing new artillery, fresh divisions, and much-needed supplies. Their lines solidified, their confidence strengthened. Moscow, battered, frightened, but unbroken, burst into a cautious sense of relief. For the moment, the city still stood. Losses on both sides were immense. German divisions shrank to fractions of their original strength. Armor numbers dropped sharply as tanks froze, broke down, or were abandoned. Soviet forces suffered heavily too, especially in the early stages of the battle. The human cost was staggering, a reminder of the scale of war on the Eastern Front: neutral, vast, and unforgiving. Strategically, the consequences stretched far beyond Moscow's snowy outskirts. The German failure to capture the city marked the end of their swift advance into the Soviet heartland. The myth of unstoppable blitzkrieg cracked. Logistics had proven as decisive as firepower. Winter had shown itself not merely a background condition, but a force with its own influence. The Soviet Union, though battered, emerged with strengthened morale. Factories farther east accelerated production unhindered. New divisions continued training. The population, seeing that Moscow had not fallen, rallied around the defense of their homeland. The survival of the capital became a symbol of endurance. In German high command, tension deepened. Commanders who had warned of logistical collapse found their concerns vindicated, but the damage was done. Strategic options narrowed. Efforts shifted to stabilizing the front and preparing for a prolonged conflict, a scenario few had expected months earlier. Had Moscow fallen, the rail networks linking Soviet industrial centers would have splintered. Political shockwaves might have rippled across the nation. But in this timeline, the Soviet leadership remained intact, communications held, and major evacuations continued. The center of governance stayed rooted, giving continuity to the war effort. Meanwhile, the Germans faced a harsh new reality. Their forces had advanced deeper into enemy territory than their supply system could sustain. The retreat created gaps in their defensive lines, forcing them to spread thin across vast terrain. A campaign meant to end quickly had transformed into a grinding war of attrition. International observers took note. The failure at Moscow signaled to the world that the German war machine was not invincible. Allied nations found renewed determination. Support to the Soviet Union increased. Broader strategic plans began shifting toward long-term confrontation. Across the Eastern Front, villages and towns experienced the aftermath differently. Some saw liberation and a return to stability. Others, caught between retreating and advancing armies, endured prolonged hardship. The civilian cost: displacement, destruction, uncertainty remained a silent, enduring consequence. The German army withdrew to more defensible positions, constructing fortified lines to weather the winter and brace for future Soviet offensives. But the aura of momentum was gone. Commanders understood that the failure to seize Moscow altered the war's trajectory. Every next campaign would grow heavier, slower, more desperate. For the Soviets, the victory was not just military. It was psychological. They had faced the full force of the German advance and survived. The capital remained in their hands. Factories continued producing at remarkable speed. The nation regained a sense of destiny. And yet both sides knew this was only the beginning. The war in the East would stretch far beyond the fields around Moscow. New offensives, new battles, new campaigns would rise from the ashes of this frozen clash. Nothing about the outcome guaranteed a swift end. Still, the consequences were undeniable. The failure to seize Moscow shifted the balance of the entire conflict. The German advance had reached as far as it could. The Soviets had proven they could halt even the strongest offensive. From this point on, the war entered a different phase one, shaped by endurance rather than speed. And in the frozen silence left behind, the world began to understand that the Eastern Front would not be won by lightning strikes, but by willpower, resources, and time itself. Reflection and analysis. History often pivots on thin edges, moments where a single advance, a single delay, or a single decision reshapes the fate of nations. The capture of Moscow in 1941 stands as one of those razor-thin turning points. In reality, Germany never seized the city, but in this scenario where they do, the consequences ripple across the global war like shockwaves. The first truth is strategic. Moscow's fall would have torn open the Soviet command structure. The psychological toll alone could have fractured Soviet morale, splintering the political cohesion that kept the Red Army fighting through catastrophic losses. The Germans believed, perhaps too confidently, that taking the Soviet capital would trigger a collapse similar to France in 1940. But the Soviet Union was not France. Its geography was vast, its industry relocatable, its population immense, and its leadership ruthless. Even with Moscow gone, the Soviet regime could, and likely would, attempt to continue the war from the east. Yet the blow would cripple their logistics and shatter the myth of invincibility surrounding Stalin's government. Militarily, Germany would gain far more than a symbolic victory. They would seize rail hubs, stockpiles, factories, and critical communication arteries. Every front from the north around Leningrad to the south near Kiev would feel the shock. German divisions, now better supplied and positioned, could press deeper into Soviet territory before the full force of winter hit. The second truth is political. A German triumph in Moscow would embolden Axis allies, intimidate neutral states, and strain Allied unity. Britain would face the terrifying possibility of a Europe entirely dominated by Germany. The United States, not yet fully mobilized for war, might accelerate its entry, but would face a stronger, more entrenched Axis bloc. Yet the third truth is one Germany never fully grasped. Taking Moscow is not the same as winning the war. The Soviet Union, even decapitated, still had space to retreat, factories beyond the Urals, and millions of potential soldiers. Winter would still come. Supply lines would still stretch thin. Resistance would still form. The fall of Moscow would change the war dramatically, violently, but it would not end it. Instead, it would set the stage for an even larger, more brutal struggle. Final verdict and alternate world outcome. In this alternate timeline, the fall of Moscow in late 1941 becomes a moment that shakes the world. The German Reich, convinced it has achieved the decisive victory it long sought, pushes deeper with renewed confidence. The swastika over the Kremlin becomes a symbol of Axis momentum proof that Hitler's war machine can flatten even the largest nation on earth. But victory carries its own poison. Germany's grip on Moscow is tight but fragile. The city is vast, devastated, starving. Keeping it functional demands troops, fuel, rail support, and supply columns across hundreds of kilometers of hostile territory. Every week stretches German logistics thinner. What they gained in prestige, they lose in sustainability. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union bleeding. Shocked, enraged retreats to the Volga and beyond. Kuibyshev becomes the temporary capital. Stalin, furious yet unbroken, orders total war. Factories in the Urals double production. Siberian divisions, still battle-hardened and acclimated to winter warfare, regroup for a massive counteroffensive, scheduled for early 1942. Internationally, the world trembles. Britain faces the nightmare of a European continent completely overshadowed by a dominant Germany. Churchill calls the fall of Moscow the darkest hour beyond our darkest hour, urging Americans to accelerate their support. The United States, recognizing the new threat, speeds up Lend-Lease shipments and pushes its war industry into overdrive months ahead of schedule. Japan watches carefully. With Germany ascendant, Tokyo considers expanding north but still hesitates, aware that a wounded Soviet Union may still bite with Siberian teeth. The global balance hangs on a knife edge. And then comes winter cruel, iron, merciless. Temperatures plunge to lethal extremes. German fuel freezes, engines die. Troops suffer frostbite by the tens of thousands. The Soviet counterattack strikes like a hammer. Not to liberate Moscow, the city is too heavily fortified now, but to break German supply routes, choke them, starve them, and grind them down month after month. By spring 1942, Moscow is a fortress but a starving one. The Wehrmacht holds it but barely. Germany has won a city. The Soviet Union still controls a continent, and the war, far from ending early, mutates into a longer, harsher, and ultimately bloodier conflict for both sides. Final verdict. Taking Moscow gives Germany its greatest symbolic victory, but also its greatest strategic trap. In conquering the Soviet capital, they inherit a burden too heavy to sustain. The Eastern Front does not collapse. It expands, intensifies, and in the end, consumes everything.